Hey, everybody. Welcome back after a holiday week in the US. As a reminder, if you could register your attendance in the meeting notes and add any agenda items that you might have. I see one from Mike and just a regular issue triage and welcome to new members. All right, why don't we get started? We could welcome new members, although looking at the list, I think I don't see anyone new here. But if I'm mistaken, please speak up. Is Chris here? Yeah, Chris. Chris, do you want to go through the triage?
Yes. So there are actually no new issues from the last time we met. There were 2 PRs, one merged, the other is just about ready for merge. So I think, why don't we push this to after the agenda and we can take a look at the backlog instead of triaging new issues.
Sounds good to me. Okay, yeah, you run. Thanks, Chris. I assume that's you typing or whoever's typing, thanks. Let's put this here. Mike, do you want to talk about feedback on SLSA v1?
Sure. Actually, before that, did we get any new members, or I didn't take a look at the attendee list? Is there anybody new who wants to introduce themselves? All right. Yeah, so got a little bit of more, just talking to folks and been in some meetings regarding sort of SLSA v1. I think generally, some of this is obviously stuff that we're talking about in the SCI positioning group, but some of it I think is related to some of the things that we're doing here. Largely, folks I think are very they like how mostly straightforward SLSA v1 is. It seems very understandable, very clear, and so on. The areas where folks seem to be most confused by is just, okay, but how do I actually implement this now? Even if there is some, obviously there's more than enough companies out there that can help folks implement it. But from a representative example standpoint, I think folks are trying to look at stuff beyond just purely the other feedback I got was like, hey, if I'm not looking at a SaaS, if I'm some giant company who has a Jenkins or a TeamCity or whatever else, right? What sorts of things, like, you don't have to tell me exactly, but what sorts of things are folks doing? I think that sort of thing seemed to be some interest in and also understanding what is the status of some of the tools that are out there. Like, there seemed to be some interest on figuring out, like, are there SLSA v1 compliant tools and yada yada, and that seemed to be the big feedback I've been getting even just in the past couple of weeks.
Thanks. Does anyone else getting feedback? I have some too, but I'll let anyone else jump in first if you've been hearing things about SLSA v1.
I had feedback, and sorry, I've been out for a while. One of the things that one of the product teams here, they're obviously trying to implement SLSA, and they're having issues with Maven and generating that provenance for Maven packages. And I know NPM has done something with regards to SLSA 1. Do you know if there's a contact or plans on helping, like, the Maven, repository or, package manager for Java specifically, help people become SLSA compliant?
So is the a question I have is the issue here that like NPM has built-in support for public packages, and you're looking for, is there going to be built-in support for like upstream Maven to support Salsa, or is the thing here that Maven, like building a package in Maven, is difficult to do via Salsa?
It's that there's no salsa provenance tooling that exists today for generating it for a Maven project. It doesn't support, and there's no support for, I think it's like WAR files. And so they're very much trying, but it's becoming very problematic. The other issue they're having is like when you are doing, I know it's also nothing to do with Tecton or Tecton toolchains, but when you're a PaaS, platform as a service, and you're trying to generate a salsa provenance for a customer's application, the tool chains or the pipelines are generating provenance for the underlying infrastructure, right? Which the customer doesn't really care about. And so, how do you enable someone to generate salsa provenance for a customer build without, showing everything that's underneath, right? I don't know how else to say it, but, you don't, regardless of whether you're Amazon or Google Cloud, or IBM Cloud, customers shouldn't care what's underneath. They should just get an attestation that says, yes, I am SLSA level 3 build compliant. And they don't necessarily need to know the details of what's underneath, but still being able to verify. So I know those are two different things, but that's the two feedback that I've been hearing from some of the people internally.
On that second part, I think that's, nobody has to, the idea here is it's, if you trust, Google, let's say, then I'm just saying, like, if you trust cloud provider XYZ with a Salsa build, then you are trusting the underlying infrastructure. You don't need to know everything about that infrastructure. And in fact, like, I'm pretty sure if Salsa isn't clear enough about it, I don't know, maybe we could be even clearer just to kind of really hit that home. But I do believe that, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's the idea here is we have that idea of the trusted control plane. And as long as, you as the end user are saying, yes, I trust this control plane, then I don't necessarily care about the underlying infrastructure, like, the details on how all that stuff is done. That's one bit. As far as the Maven piece, I think it's worthwhile, obviously, to sort of pull in other folks who might be interested in building out Maven tooling and so on. But I believe, this is where some of this here might be worthwhile to based on, I think, some recent conversations, I think it's up to the industry to, build Maven tooling for this sort of thing. I don't know if there's anybody who is currently building anything out of that. I know that, yeah, as Nicole sort of posted here, there's some work on, there's been some work on witness attesters, but they're slightly different than Salsa attesters, but you might be able to kind of use that.
Lauren?
Yeah, so I've been working on the Salsa GitHub generators, and we have 3 Java builders that we're going to announce next month. One for Gradle, one for Maven, and one for JReleaser, which is a Java build action. So I don't know if that's relevant.
Yeah, it helps
But
some.
yeah, I just wanted to put it out there.
Yeah, it does help some, but not everybody uses GitHub Actions. As an example, internally, we use GitHub Enterprise, and the way the GitHub Enterprise works internally, it's behind what's on public GitHub Enterprise, not because of our choosing. And so it doesn't have GitHub Actions. So we can't even have that as an option. So it does help, but it would be good, like NPM, right? If Maven was able to kind of do this for the industry versus everybody having to come up with something on their own.
On our side, we have our own build system, and what we do is that we are going to distribute only the things and our customer needs to reproduce the build, but nothing about the control plane itself. And basically, the control plane does not impact the output of the build. It's an automation for us, but it doesn't impact the. So that's where we stop the provenance for us. I don't know if it's.
Yeah, that is helpful. I'm just curious, you know, if a customer wanted to verify, right? How do they verify that attestation, right? If they don't have the provenance file to verify against, because that provenance file might share too much information, how would one go about doing that without altering the provenance document and then re-signing it, right? Like, we don't want to do that. We want to have a way to let the customer verify, but not share too much information about the control plane.
I'm now I think a little confused there. Never mind.
Chris?
So I think the scenario you're describing is what VSAs are for, where you can't share full provenance because it's sharing too much information, but you do want to offer some attestation that's also was done and that the artifact beats some level.
Can you repeat that first part, because it was breaking up on my end?
I think that you should use VSAs for this
VSAs.
scenario.
Okay, got it. And I see Mikey, similar issues when I was doing some, ended up transforming SBOMs into salsa from a. Mikey, do you want to speak to what you have? Thanks, Chris. I'll note that down.
I found that in Maven, my biggest problem was like the dependencies that Maven uses is some kind of closest version you have in your POM, and there's like arguments over there. So all the transformation in the build between the dependencies are quite complex. So I needed somehow to like plug into the Maven library, but like to its own library to gain access to this. I found that OWASP SBOM generator actually gives you a nice SBOM out of it as a plugin for Maven. And it included most of the things I needed for my provenance. So I did something weird that like I can take an SBOM into a provenance. I don't recommend it, but that's what I needed to do for my clients.
Thanks for that. Mike?
Yeah, so I think some of my confusion, because I think there's two separate problems here. One is making generation of the provenance easy when you run something like Maven, because like NPM itself also is probably worth pointing out that NPM uses the GitHub generator for the provenance and currently doesn't support anything outside of that. I mean, they do plan to support potentially other SaaS runners for sort of the NPM side of things. So that's actually something separate as well, which is like, yeah, they actually don't support, like you can't use, as far as I know, you could still generate salsa provenance, but it's not through that built-in NPM piece, I believe. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong there. And then on the other end is the actual sort of like, yeah, I don't want to potentially give them everything, and then and then how do I do that? Like, how do I do something like a VSA for folks who are just, I want to give folks some information about how I'm building something, but not the entirety.
Yeah, so for the NPM, if NPM is providing the salsa provenance for a given package, and maybe I'm misunderstanding this, why would it matter that they're using GitHub Actions? Because they're providing it.
But because you need to, so in this case, it's for open source projects,
Yes.
mostly for open source projects here. And the idea here is, if I'm an open source provider, I can go and say, hey, I am using something, and that thing is generating salsa provenance, and it gets pushed to NPM. But NPM has said they will only take provenance from approved services, right? Because
Got it.
it's now on NPM to say, who do I trust from a salsa build perspective? And in this case, obviously NPM, Microsoft, everything else, it's very easy for them to say right now, at least, that for GitHub. But I do believe that they're planning to support GitLab and other Circle CI and others as well. But at that point, I believe the idea is, and in fact, they pretty much said, like, there's no way for them to just sort of take a random person, so like if Mike, me, if I come out and say, hey, I ran a salsa build, trust me, NPM is not going to go and just say, no, I have no proof that you ran that on what we consider to be a secure builder.
Got it. Okay, thanks for clarifying, and appreciate all the feedback. I might reach out to a couple folks afterwards. Oh, Laura?
Yeah, I wanted to get back on the what Michael said on NPM only trusts certain builders. I guess that makes sense, but I think there would also be some value of having, it would be good to have provenance even if it's not signed, because if other people can then verify that maybe when they run the build, they get the same content, or maybe they just want to rebuild and decide that they don't want to use the upstream package. That could also be, having unsigned provenance can basically provide some hints on how to build a package, basically, if some people don't feel comfortable, using the upstream package or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's what I was envisioning, that it didn't matter what it was from an NPM package standpoint, right? Some, would be trusted and some others wouldn't, but at least you would still have data about that package and you wouldn't have to create it on your own.
Shall we move on?
Yeah, I'm done. Thank you.
All right, just checking, just confirming. Okay. In terms of other feedback from V1, I've also heard from a couple, like in my discussions with other implementers within my company, I think there's still more work to do to make, well, I guess two main things. One, I think we still have more work to do to make salsa more, like the build track more clear, like what the objectives are, and exactly how, like similar to Mike said, like how to actually implement it. Because I still think it's not the point where someone just picks up and just does it. For example, what is the relationship between external parameters and resolved dependencies? There's been a lot of back and forth discussion about that. For example, trying to write notes real quick. like for example, if you take a Git repo as a parameter and you accept like a URL and a branch name, ultimately that gets resolved to some sort of commit. Where, like, do you just record those as two separate fields and then normalize it in resolved dependencies? Do you just report it in resolved dependencies because it's only like it's kind of duplicate information? Do you normalize it into a URL in external parameters so that way it's in kind of a standard format? Do you put the commit in external parameters? I mean, I have opinions and I've interpret that, but I don't think it's to the point where like I feel like we need documentation and kind of like sort of like applied rulings or almost something like that where we say, these are our suggestions. It kind of looks like this. The other thing, one second, Mike. So Git repo. On a similar note, it seems like there might be value in having a standard build type for CI/CD systems because they all kind of take the same sets of parameters. There's seemingly usually a build configuration that lives in some sort of source repo like Git. There is possibly a separate thing of the thing to be built. In GitHub Actions, for example, that is not a parameter. It's the two are the same. But in other systems, like for example, Google Cloud Build or Tekton, you could have, I'm not sure about Tekton, but Google Cloud Build, you could have as two different parameters. And then like a bunch of additional stuff in some sort of schema, usually key value pairs, but not always. So that might be some value in just, because they all kind of represent the same stuff, it might be good to have like a common schema. Anyway, Mike.
Yeah, so on the two things you put out there. So on the first one, I think yeah, so we've heard similar, and one of the things that I think we at least initially came to, and obviously be interested in feedback, is having duplicate information is better than not having the information at all. So at least to start off with, I think folks would be seem to be okay with something like, yeah, it's okay to have maybe say that I have the commit ID duplicated in both as a parameter as well as, let's say, the dependencies or whatever. There seem to be like folks seem to be okay with that sort of thing, because like, hey, I'd rather capture it in multiple places than forget to capture it in one. So that's one thing. And then to the other point you brought up, so one of the things we're working on, and we'd love to open source soon, is we're starting to poke around with the idea of almost like a SLSA API. So the idea is I have a SLSA builder. The SLSA builder takes in some parameters, and an output is a SLSA is a SLSA attestation. And then the idea here would be, whatever the implementation is obviously, you need to, from a conformance standpoint, but the actual API should be pretty straightforward of like, what are the expected inputs and then what are the expected outputs. And so that's something that I think we've also been poking around with. But I think, yeah, on that end, I think it would be worthwhile to kind of talk about maybe some best practices at some point around like, yeah, what do folks normally expect from an input? Normally expect for like a SLSA build to require as far as inputs, and what should, and what are the sort of conditions for the API, and then what would the expected outputs be? And then obviously the implementation itself is very clearly defined in some of the SLSA pieces, SLSA levels.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, yeah, I think something to make this easier. Another piece I'm running into like repeatedly is I think we have an open bug for this or issue. Like the need, maybe I think we need to be more upfront about the idea is that you model the build, like you define some interface, like you draw a box around the build and say the external parameters are the things crossing that interface. and we're not really describing the details of what goes on inside, because that comes up a lot. For example, a lot of CI/CD systems have like multiple levels of abstraction. There's like a workflow, and the workflow has like a pipeline, say, or something like that, and that has multiple jobs, and each run in like a VM, say, and the jobs have multiple tasks, which may be run in containers. And are you describing like how they work and that level of detail? Because it comes up with like, this information could be useful, that information could be useful. And so you kind of get off in, I feel like, a misleading track, like that, I feel like that information is, we should be thinking about what is the use case for why you're doing that. And like SBOM, for example, is designed to have that level of detail. And so I think that we probably need more guidance around like what information we're recording, how we model it, and why, and to limit the amount of work. So that way we say, like, for Providence, say, we record this for this other type of information. While yes, that's useful for other use cases, you should do this other thing. Yeah, I think Mike has the other person, Mikey.
Yeah. Yeah, I've actually heard similar feedback. A lot of the feedback I've heard is that, hey, I don't necessarily need provenance for these QA tests that I'm running that are other steps in my CI/CD pipeline. I only really care about getting it for the actual, my package, the whether it's like I built a container and here's how I built it, or I built this Go app and here's here's the inputs to the Go app. All these other pieces, though maybe long-term, are important for something like a Salsa, maybe not super important right now, where the bigger thing, to kind of go back to a little bit of what Melbo was saying, is like, hey, how do I just get it from my WAR file? That's the thing I care about. Yeah.
Mikey?
Yeah, so I think I understand the question a bit differently. And I'll try to answer and see if it correlates to what you were asking. So in my own provenance creation, and actually in all of my evidence creation, not only like the Salsa provenance one, I find it useful to like normalize. I call these like it's groups of fields. So if you're talking about the build, so I have a pipeline object with a workflow, a job, a build ID, a actor. I have some normalization, and then I go over all these actual CIs, and I see how I normalize everything into specific fields. Now, specifically in Salsa, what I do is I put it in the environment object, which is kind of natural for it, but I define how these subfields should be filled. So I have a Git object with commit, a branch, a ref, a URL. I have this Kubernetes one. I have all these kind of like sub labels for the environment that I can normalize over these systems and be agnostic to like where this build was actually built. Define it a bit better for all my evidence. And I basically use it mostly for indexing. Like the subject is not enough in the internal attestation for me. It's like it's not enough for me to know the hash or the name of an attestation. I would like to query attestations connected to a Git commit or attestation connected to a specific build and a specific CI. So that's how I find this useful, at least in my application.
Thanks. So yeah, I feel like, we already had the open issues. I don't want to open another issue, but I think these kinds of things that we're talking about is probably useful to kind of regularly talk about and see what are the most important, and try to improve the docs. I'm going to be in the coming weeks spending more time on kind of getting through the backlog. And so if folks want to, obviously any contributions to try to figure out how to better address this, either with the existing docs or like if we need larger changes, ideas on, for like a V2 type of thing. Not that I want to start conversation about V2 now, but like if there are any sort of fundamental problems or like, oh, this was a bad idea, we could start recording them too. I don't know such a thing yet, but it's worth thinking about. Any other feedback on V1? All right, great. I think Mike had the next one on APAC time zone.
Yeah, so it's sort of related to the feedback actually, but speaking to a couple of different folks actually about some of the feedback, and one of the things that kind of came up as a key piece was there's actually a lot of interest in APAC, countries and organizations that are out there that are very interested in SLSA. A lot of them have a lot of they have a lot of open questions and stuff like that. And there seemed to be interest around like, hey, what can we do to start like building out a community out there? Because I know that, for example, Samsung had contributed the Jenkins plugin to us, to the SLSA community. They also have a bunch of stuff. Cat bit me. So, ow, sorry. Sorry, cat bit me. Anyway, so this from the SLSA side of things, interest in the APAC stuff. We have like Samsung and some other groups out there because I know the folks from Oracle have built out some stuff. There also just seems to be interest over there. There also seems to be interest in something like some recorded content coming from us beyond the blogs. Whether it is something like a SLSA, best practices guide, even like a 2 or 3 pager of just like, nobody's saying here's how to actually implement it at a down level low. But like here's just some general ideas, stuff like a webinar, stuff like even myself, I might be recording some stuff on behalf of the LF to send out to some of those folks out there. But there seemed to be some interest to see if also maybe we can extend the community a bit. I know it's a little difficult, especially with a meeting like this, where a lot of the folks who've been working on the specification for so long are mostly working at these hours. But it might still be useful to at least get some sort of meetings going, so that we can also maybe collect that feedback on an ongoing basis and make sure it kind of comes back here, so we get a better idea of like, how's the rest of the world using SLSA? Are there any issues they're running into? And yeah.
We could do a once a month APAC friendly time zone meeting and see if people participate. So that way it's not, too much overhead at the beginning. And if people do join, then we might be able to get folks from APAC to help run that meeting at a more frequent timeline.
Well, yeah, it seems like there's interest. I can definitely forward on that information over to Julian from the LF, who was the one who I was talking with about some of that interest, that there was some interest over there.
I think the biggest challenge is going to be cross-pollination between the two groups. Like but yeah, I fully support the endeavor. I just am unlikely to attend personally.
Same here, but so at least me personally, I'm out in Asia once or twice a year, so I might be able to still be able to at least help out there. But it does sound like the LF is interested in, even from the LF side, helping organize that if they can, so whether it's making sure those meetings get recorded and the notes get put somewhere that we can, and helping facilitate the cross-pollination. Because I agree that that sort of stuff can often get lost, because we're seeing that in a lot of the other groups where it's like, hey, the Europe folks were discussing the same exact thing and came to slightly different conclusions, and how do you reconcile and that sort of thing.
I'd be curious if an Asia specific meeting is desired, or if better asynchronous communication is desired or desirable. So that would be a great first topic of discussion for an APAC friendly meeting, I imagine.
So I know there's
it-
folks from, oh, sorry, Mark.
Go please.
I was going to say, I know there's some folks here from the Europe time zone. I don't know how much overlap there is, because I think it's late for you all, late afternoon, right? Right now, Josh and Nicholas. I don't know who else is.
It's 6:30 p.m.
Yeah. And so I know if there's an earlier meeting in the day, like for example, I have a counterpart in Hong Kong, and he will join meetings at like 9 a.m. Central, so that's 10 a.m. Eastern, right? And a little bit earlier. So perhaps that's a way of still being in Europe, business hours friendly, but it's still early enough for Asia Pacific that it's not sleepy time yet. No, it wouldn't be US West Coast friendly. There won't be any time that would be US West Coast friendly and Asia Pacific friendly with the rest of. So that's why I was recommending maybe if there was like a Europe APAC friendly time, like once a month, then that would help, at least get some more coverage. And it could just be an additional meeting, or maybe one of the 4 meetings a month would be APAC friendly.
So I think basically this is just, people are supportive of it. We're just waiting on someone to actually organize it, right? And I think there's no way that everyone will be able to participate, just because people are distributed all around the globe and there's
Correct.
non-overlapping working hours. And so it seems like we'll have the case that some subsets go to different meetings, and that's what we'll live with. So I think if anyone wants to organize that, we could just go ahead and just propose particular time, or if we do some sort of alternation, I think that represents, I didn't hear anyone opposed to that idea, like once a month or something like that.
Yeah. So on that, in that case, can definitely get back to the LF on that one. And I think at least probably, and I have no problem doing this once or twice, but I have no problem sort of helping facilitate the initial sort of meetings, just so that folks like understand, like, hey, here's somebody from the salsa community, as opposed to it just being a bunch of folks who are probably going to have questions and then be like, wait a second, there's nobody here who's worked on salsa. But I know that there are, like, for example, some folks who might be interested who have done a lot of work on salsa, like, for example, Ian Lewis, who I know is out in Tokyo and some other folks who have been doing at least some work on that end, who might be able to help. Like I know also the Oracle folks, but I know that at least from the LF side, they're interested because they've been getting feedback from some organizations saying, hey, we want to learn more about SLSA, but the only times that, the only times where that seems to be available is at 12 a.m. or 2 a.m. their time. Yeah.
I know that OpenSSF has had 2 meetups in Hong Kong or China recently. One was in Hong Kong. I think the other one was maybe in Shanghai. So one of the meetings, there was a Google person that talked about SLSA. I don't know if they work with you all. Mark, and I think I forget who else is from Google on here. But there does seem to be some people that are tuned in China, and so potentially those could also be folks, since they presented on it, they could help facilitate as well.
Sounds good. Shall we move on to the next agenda item?
Yeah, I think that's me. Just an FYI, the conformance program proposal, I'm going to merge the PR on Friday. It's been sitting without any real discussion for quite a few weeks. I'm going to submit it as a draft, so it can still change, but I just want to close out the PR. So take another look if you're interested. And I do need volunteers to be either maintainers or reviewers for the self-attestation questionnaires. I'll reach out to a few folks individually as well, but I want to give everyone interested the opportunity to volunteer. Then moving on to the issue backlog, there's a giant backlog here. So I grabbed, was this 4 issues that I think we can clear off relatively easily. The first is trustlessness of provenance using public DLTs. This is an issue, a drive-by issue from someone who is interested in putting SLSA on the blockchain. I don't see it as actionable, and I think we should close it.
Yeah, +1 to that one.
Done. All right. Next, this I believe is the issue Mark mentioned earlier about clarifying how the requirement that you model your build system and define its inputs and outputs. It looks like there's been some work on this already. So I think what we need to do to make this actionable to close out is find the gap between where we are and what exactly we want. Do I have a volunteer for that?
Which issue was this again? What number?
706. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I dropped these in the meeting notes. I can also put them in the chat.
Yeah, never mind. Now let me take a look at the doc. 1 second.
Just kind of a point of order. I mean, Chris, when you close the issues like this, it's good to put a little comment saying, per call decision on the call, put a reference to
yes.
date so that, the one you just closed before, I was like, if somebody just looks at the GitHub, they're like, oh, it was closed, no explanation. So it looks a bit weird. We don't have to be very long, but just put a reference to meeting notes and that's good enough. They can figure it out.
Okay.
But 706 is a PR which claims to address it. And was merged. Do you know if there's still kind of context from the issue that's not addressed by the PR?
Well, I believe this is the open issue Mark was talking about earlier when he said we needed more information on modeling build platforms. So I guess Mark is the one to answer that question, or is what would he like to see taken up, or should this issue be closed and a new one opened?
For 706?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess we could just assign it to me, and then I will do something with it. Either make it more actionable or perhaps propose something myself. That's fine. I'll assign myself right now.
Okay. Thank you. Let's see. The next one is 866. I'll drop it in the chat. This came out of the conversation a few weeks ago about security framework, compliance requirements, maturity models. And I don't believe this issue is actionable as it is. And so I'm curious if folks want to act on it and what the action would be. Melba?
Is it 866?
Yes, and I dropped a link in the chat.
Okay. Yeah, so 866, I remember this being talked about by Jay a while ago, that there's mention throughout either the website or maybe the FAQs, there's difference between, like, what a security framework is versus compliance requirement versus a maturity model. So I think he's requesting that there be more clarity on what SLSA truly is. If we're trying to go for a security framework, let's call it that consistently. But I don't believe he thinks it's a security framework. So I think that's where the issue comes from.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it also depends on audience, because there's going to be certain folks who work primarily in the compliance side of things that are going to say, hey, when you say attestation, it means this. But attestation has multiple definitions depending on context, right? Like there's an attestation as far as, like, this is just an example of some of the stuff that he was pointing out. But they're like, for example, an attestation in compliance means somebody has signed off on a thing to hit some sort of requirement from a regulatory sort of standpoint, right? Or some sort of policy standpoint, which is different than, let's say, a hardware attestation, which a hardware attestation is, usually a security, like a TPM or a similar security, hardware security device, making a claim on the state of something happening in the hardware, which is very different than an attestation, or not very different, but like is different than an attestation as far as in toto is calling it, which is like a claim. And they're all related, but I think it's worthwhile really, like in a glossary or something like that, just highlighting a little bit of what we mean so that folks who are looking at it, because once again, once you start to talk to enough people, there's going to be folks who are like, oh yeah, attestation, I know the in toto stuff. But then there's going to be other folks who are like looking at SLSA and saying, hey, does SLSA fit into our broader like controls framework. And then they bring that in and they go, wait a second, when they say attestation here, who's attesting? Like, who's the person signing off on this? And then they're going to go and say, oh, okay, I see. You know, they're going to get confused. And then it's like, but if there's a glossary that says, hey, when we say attestation, we are specifically talking about this, this, and this, especially in a glossary, so that somebody who is, you know, just who is coming at it from a different context can understand what context we're talking about it.
Yeah, I remember we had a like fairly healthy discussion about this a few weeks back, and I think one of the conclusions was that many of us working on SLSA didn't have the context to be able to make the clarification that was being requested, specifically with regards to the initial question in the issue. Like, I can't tell you what the distinction is between a security framework, compliance requirements, and a maturity model. We do have a terminology page where we try to make some of the other things clearer. So I'm wondering if it makes sense, instead of saying like we should be clearer about X, if we have like a blog post or a document that is like SLSA for I don't know, people who understand SOX or whatever, or SLSA for people that have this kind of job function. And instead of trying to make the text, like the spec, cover all of these different things, or a glossary cover all of these different things, instead provide like a focus document that introduces it for people with this particular background. Just a suggestion. I'm not sure we can do much with this issue as it is, so I'm trying to think of ways that we can try and address the issue, the problem space.
So your suggestion is to, I guess, sort of either blog posts or perhaps through expanding the SLSA for X documents. Like add one for what, compliance officers maybe?
Yeah, and I'm not even, yeah. In some ways it feels like punting because I'm not a compliance officer, so I still can't do that. But like, can we make this a more tractable issue so that people with those skills can help us to author something? Because I don't feel like trying to disambiguate the terminology in the spec is going to be something that I'm struggling to see how we would be able to do that and still satisfy for the multiple different audiences. Ultimately, you know, there's lots of efforts happening within security and software supply chain security more specifically, where these terms are very loaded depending on what context you come with. And so instead of trying to disambiguate the terms or find alternative terms, I'm wondering if providing focused documentation for those specific audiences is the easier way to make things clearer.
That sounds good to me. I can update the bug with that suggestion, or sorry, the issue with that suggestion. It also occurs to me now that the dashboard does not have an untriaged portion, so everything old got stuck in backlog. I think this issue does truly belong on a backlog, which is different to being untriaged. So I'll make that change. The last issue I picked up is 727. Let me drop it in the chat. This one, I believe, is pretty much shovel ready. Is declare a preference for signing methodologies that rely on transparency logs. This came out of the review for the verifying artifacts page, and provided the change is not controversial, it's pretty straightforward if somebody, for example, were looking for a first issue in the spec.
Yeah, I think the only thing that prevents this from being shovel ready, well, maybe it's shovel ready for existing contributors, but the issue lacks some context, short of bouncing you to read through the conversation in the PR. So yeah, sorry, bit of a tangent, I guess, but I'm trying to see if we're drawing a distinction between contributions that are good for new contributors or contributions that are kind of work that's ready to do for existing contributors. And I think you probably meant the latter, so I should have just been quiet. Sorry.
No need to be sorry. I actually also haven't quite decided on what I think the shovel-worthy tag means, because I don't think we have a good first issue tag. Maybe we should. But okay, I will mark this as shovel ready. Do we have a volunteer to pick it up?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Okay. All right, thank you. Then we are just about at time. So I'll stop going over issues now.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate you doing the triage stuff. Really useful.
Yes, thanks a lot, Chris. And thanks everyone for participating. All right, thanks everyone. We'll see you again soon. Talk to you.
Quick point of order. It's July 4th next week, I think. Does that mean, like, what are we likely to have a meeting? It's on Tuesday, not Monday, but you know.
Good point. Yes. What do folks think? I will be out. Google gives off that day. I don't know other companies. I guess do we have critical mass to meet?
Comments are trending towards no.
Yeah.
Maybe we can confirm it slightly.
Yeah, my inclination is to just cancel. Like meeting bi-weekly seems fine.
Yep, that seems fine to me as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Good point. I'll add it to the notes right now. Thank you so much for remembering that.
No problem.
Great. All right. Well, I'll see everyone in 2 weeks then.
Thanks, everyone.